It started on a quiet Saturday morning in the spring of 1978. The kind of morning that felt ordinary enough to be forgotten if it hadn't turned into the day. Everything split in two, because Ray Patterson was sitting at the kitchen table with a carburetor laid out on a piece of old newspaper, his hands black with grease, the smell of gasoline faint but familiar, the radio low in the background talking about planting forecasts and commodity prices, when his son Michael walked in holding a glossy John Deere brochure like it was a verdict already decided. And Ray didn't look up at first because he was adjusting a float valve on a tractor older than his son, a Farmall H from 1947 that had been starting the same way for 30 years. If you treated it right, and Michael stood there for a second longer than usual, waiting to be noticed before he finally said, "Dad, we need to talk about the farm." And that was when Ray knew this wasn't going to be a small conversation, because Michael hadn't been home from college for even 2 weeks yet. And already the tone in his voice had changed, sharper, more certain, like someone who'd learned a new language and couldn't hear the old one anymore. Ray kept his eyes on the carburetor and said, "About what?" Because he wanted Michael to say it out loud, wanted to hear where this was going before he gave it the respect of eye contact. And Michael didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and laid the brochure flat on the table, right over the newspaper, right next to the carburetor parts. Bright green and yellow against oil stains, and steel, and said, "About the equipment, about the way we're running this place." And Ray finally looked up then, not at his son, but at the picture of a brand new John Deere 4440, clean enough to eat off of, cab sealed tight, air conditioning, sound guard body, 120 horsepower of promise, and for a moment Ray said nothing at all, because he'd seen that picture before, or ones like it, every month for years now, mailed to the house, handed out at the dealer, shown off at coffee shops. And Michael took the silence as an opening and kept going, words spilling out like he'd been rehearsing them since graduation, saying the tractors were older than he was, that the 4020 was 13 years old, that the Farmall was over 30, that efficiency mattered now, that time mattered now, that this new tractor could cut field time in half, that they could handle more acres, lease the Morrison place, grow the operation. And when Ray finally raised his eyes to his son's face, he saw something that unsettled him more than the brochure ever could, because Michael wasn't asking, he was presenting a case, the way you do when you already believe the decision is obvious. And Ray asked one question, slow and calm, "You know what that tractor costs?" And Michael nodded, already smiling, already relieved to be getting to the numbers, and said, "42,000. But we don't have to pay it all at once. Dealer says 15% down, 12% interest over 7 years. And Ray felt something tighten in his chest at the word interest, because numbers like that don't just live on paper, they follow you home. They sit with you at night, they wake you up at 3 in the morning. And he set the wrench down carefully and said, "So you want me to go $36,000 into debt?" And Michael said, "It's not debt, Dad. It's an investment." Like he'd been taught to replace one word with another, and Ray almost laughed at that, but didn't, because Michael was leaning forward now, animated, explaining how everyone else was expanding, how the Hendersons had just bought 2 new tractors, how the Kramers were running all new equipment, how farms that didn't grow were getting left behind. And Ray listened, really listened, because this wasn't just about a tractor. It was about what Michael thought success looked like. And when Michael finally paused, waiting for agreement, Ray said quietly, "Left behind where?" And Michael said, "In productivity, in the market. Dad, some years we're barely breaking even." And that was when Ray's calm cracked just enough for the truth underneath to show, because he pushed his chair back and stood up, slow but solid, and said, "Barely breaking even," and repeated it like he was testing the weight of it. Then pointed out the window at the fields he'd worked since he came back from Korea in 1953, pointed at the land that was paid for, the tractors that were paid for, every implement in the shed that was paid for, and said, "I owe exactly $0 to any bank. That's not barely breaking even, that's winning." And Michael shook his head, frustrated, because to him that sounded like settling, and he said, "It's not winning if we can't grow." And Ray asked, "Why do we need to grow?" And Michael answered without thinking, because that's what successful farms do. And Ray felt the weight of 30 years press into that moment. The mornings before dawn, the year's prices dropped, the year's rain didn't come. The memory of his own father standing in a Nebraska field in 1932, watching men load equipment onto trucks, because the bank said it was theirs now, and he walked to the window and said, "Let me tell you about leverage." And when Michael tried to interrupt, saying this wasn't 1932, Ray turned back and said, "Debt works the same way it always has. You owe the bank owns you." And Michael said that was old thinking, and Ray didn't deny it. He just said that old thinking kept the farm in the family, put food on the table every year, sent Michael to college without a dollar of debt. And Michael's jaw tightened because that was true and inconvenient. And he said, "I didn't go to school for 4 years to come back and farm like it's 1955. And Ray answered, "Nobody's making you." And that was when the conversation tipped from disagreement into something sharper, because Michael asked, "What's that supposed to mean?" And Ray said, "If you can't farm without a $40,000 tractor, maybe you can't farm." And the room went quiet enough to hear the radio crackle. And Michael stared at his father like he didn't recognize him, and said, "So that's it. Your way or nothing." And Ray picked the carburetor back up, the conversation already over in his mind, and said, "My way is the only way on this farm. When it's your farm, you can do whatever you want." And Michael asked when that would be. And Ray said, "When you understand what it takes to keep it." And Michael grabbed the brochure, anger flashing now, and said he had offers, that Henderson Farms wanted him as a foreman, that they were running a real operation with new equipment and professional management. And Ray didn't raise his voice, didn't plead. He just said, "Then maybe you should take it." And the words hung there heavier than any argument, because Michael hadn't expected that, hadn't expected his father to let him walk. And he asked, "You're serious?" And Ray said, "As a heart attack." And that was the moment something broke that couldn't be fixed with time alone, because Michael wasn't trying to hurt his father. He was trying to help, and Ray wasn't trying to control his son. He was trying to protect what he'd built, but neither could step into the other's fear. And when Michael said, "You'd rather lose your son than buy a tractor," Ray answered with the truth that had guided every decision of his adult life. "I'd rather my son understand what I spent 30 years building." And Michael left then, the door closing harder than necessary, the sound of the pickup starting in the yard, gravel spraying as he drove away. And Ray sat back down at the table, picked up the wrench, hands steady, chest heavy, because winning doesn't always feel like winning in the moment. And when Sarah came in later and asked if he thought he'd been wrong, Ray said no, not because he didn't love his son, but because he loved him enough to refuse to teach him that debt was the answer to fear. And that night Michael didn't come home, and the Farmall H sat in the shed cooling down. Red paint faded, engine ticking softly, waiting for another season, unaware that it had just become the silent witness to a choice that would take years to fully reveal its cost. Michael didn't slow down until the Patterson farmhouse was a mile behind him. The gravel road straight and empty, fields still brown from winter on both sides. And even then his foot stayed heavier on the accelerator than it needed to be, because leaving felt like the only way to prove something now, not just to his father but to himself. And by the time he reached the highway, his anger had settled into something colder and more dangerous, certainty, the kind that tells you you're not running away, you're moving forward. Because Henderson Farms didn't feel like a consolation prize when he arrived. It felt like validation, 8,000 acres stretching across the county. Rows of new green iron lined up outside the machine sheds like soldiers, radios crackling, trucks moving, men everywhere. And the first thing that struck Michael wasn't the size of it all, but the speed. Everything humming, everything moving at once. And when Mr. Henderson shook his hand and said they liked his education, liked his ideas, liked the way he talked about efficiency and growth, Michael felt something loosen in his chest. Because here, finally, was a place that spoke his language. And the days filled up fast after that. Meetings in the morning, equipment checks, planning sessions that ran long into the evening. And for the first time since leaving home, Michael felt useful in the way he'd imagined success would feel. Not grease under his fingernails, but charts and schedules and acreage targets. And every week there was something new arriving: another tractor, another planter, another piece of equipment financed and rolled into place without ceremony, because that was just how things were done here. And when Michael drove the company pickup past the Patterson place sometimes, he saw the same old machines in the shed, the same slow rhythm, and a part of him felt a tight, defensive satisfaction, like he'd escaped something small and limiting. And back on the home farm, Ray kept planting the same way he always had. The 4020 pulling the planter steady and patient, taking longer, yes, but getting done. And Sarah watched him work and didn't ask again if he thought he'd been wrong, because she knew better than to push when Ray had already made peace with his decision. And spring turned into summer, and summer into fall. And Michael came home less and less, first because he was busy, then because it was awkward, and when he did stop by, conversations stayed polite and shallow, weather and yields and nothing else, because there were things both men knew better than to say. And by the end of that first year, Henderson Farms looked unstoppable. Yields were strong, expansion plans bigger, and Michael was promoted, assistant operations manager, before he was 26. Good salary, company truck, a sense of momentum that made the past feel distant. And when interest rates ticked up in the news or commodity prices dipped for a week or two, no one panicked, because Henderson had scale. And scale, Michael had learned, smoothed out risk. And when he lay in bed at night exhausted, body heavy from 16-hour days, he told himself this was what growth felt like: pressure and payoff intertwined. And back home, Ray listened to the same news reports, the same talk of rates and markets, and he didn't change a thing, because he'd lived long enough to know that the early signs rarely announce themselves loudly. They whisper, and the whispers sounded familiar. And in 1980, when Henderson bought more land, leveraged further, rolled debt into debt without slowing down, Michael felt a flicker of unease he didn't quite recognize, because the numbers were getting big enough now that they stopped feeling real. Millions instead of thousands. Interest payments that lived on spreadsheets instead of in checking accounts. And when he mentioned once, carefully, that things were moving fast, Mr. Henderson clapped him on the shoulder and said that was the point. That fortune favored the bold. That standing still was the real risk. And Michael nodded, because that matched everything he'd been taught. And besides, nothing had gone wrong yet. And back on the Patterson farm, nothing had gone spectacularly right either. No sudden windfall, no expansion, just steady work and steady bills paid on time. And in quiet moments, Ray wondered where his son was, wondered what he was learning, wondered if the world would teach him gently or the hard way. And as the decade turned and the weather stayed unpredictable and the talk at the co-op grew more cautious, Henderson Farms pushed harder, planting around the clock, chasing yields to cover obligations that no longer fit comfortably inside a good year. And Michael felt the pace tighten, meetings longer, tempers shorter, sleep thinner. And still he told himself this was normal. This was what real operations looked like, because to admit otherwise would mean questioning not just Henderson, but the choice he'd made when he walked out of his father's kitchen. And that was something he wasn't ready to do yet. Not while the machines were still running. Not while the illusion of control still held, thin but intact, like a bridge that hasn't started to creak out loud. By the time 1981 arrived, the sense of momentum at Henderson Farms was still there on the surface, but underneath it had begun to change shape, subtle at first, the way pressure changes before a storm without anyone being able to point to a single cloud and say this is where it starts. Because the machines were running, the acreage kept increasing. The numbers on paper still looked impressive, but conversations no longer felt light. And Michael noticed that meetings stretched longer without producing clarity. That words like temporary and short-term were being used to describe problems that refused to stay small. And he told himself this was simply the cost of operating at scale, because nothing about Henderson Farms allowed room for hesitation anymore. Not when millions of dollars were tied up in land payments, equipment notes, and operating loans that had to be renewed on time or not at all. And so the solution to every tightening margin was always the same. Plant more, run faster, squeeze efficiency out of people instead of machines. And Michael worked harder than he ever had, not out of ambition now but out of necessity. Because the operation depended on momentum, the way a bicycle depends on forward motion. And slowing down felt like falling over, and when interest rates climbed again and again, numbers that had once seemed abstract began to show up in ways he couldn't ignore. Monthly payments that no longer shrank with a good harvest. Interest charges that arrived regardless of weather. And he started waking up tired even after sleeping, his mind already running through schedules and contingencies before his feet hit the floor. And still, when he drove the company truck past the Patterson farm on the way to town, he saw his father moving at the same pace he always had, planting when the ground was ready, fixing equipment instead of replacing it. And Michael dismissed the unease that followed those moments, telling himself that small operations could afford to be slow because they didn't matter as much, and that real farming happened at scale now. But by 1980, the cracks widened. Corn prices dipped just enough to make the margins thin instead of comfortable, and Henderson responded by doubling down, leasing more land, financing more equipment, because stopping expansion would have meant admitting that the entire model only worked under perfect conditions, and no one at that table was ready to say that out loud. And Michael watched the debt stack higher, roll over into itself, watched interest compound in a way that felt detached from the physical reality of planting and harvest, and something about that separation unsettled him, because the farm he grew up on never owed more tomorrow than it did today. And here the future was already spoken for, sold in pieces to people who had never set foot in a field. And yet from the outside, Henderson Farms looked unstoppable. Acres planted in flawless rows, grain bins filling, equipment polished and ready. And if you judged success by appearances alone, there was nothing to question. And that was what made the first real sign of trouble so unsettling. Because it didn't come with drama or warning, it came with stillness. An August afternoon in 1983, when Ray Patterson was walking his soybean fields and noticed a line of green equipment parked along the county road. 6 massive four-wheel drive tractors, combines, grain trucks, all sitting idle in the heat like animals waiting for water. And Ray stood there longer than he needed to, because equipment that size didn't stop during harvest preparation, unless something had gone wrong beyond repair. And the next morning at the co-op, he asked about it casually, keeping his voice even. And the answer came back in a low tone, meant to travel no farther than necessary. The bank had pulled Henderson's operating loan, fuel accounts frozen, parts suppliers cut off, and Ray felt the weight of recognition settle in, because this was the moment he'd been waiting for without wanting. The moment when work stops not because there's nothing to dobe you, because permission has been revoked. And back at Henderson Farms, the shift was immediate and brutal. Crews sent home, meetings canceled, machines parked with no timeline for restart. And Michael stood in the yard surrounded by equipment that now belonged, in effect, to someone else. And the scale he had trusted to protect them turned overnight into a liability too large to manage. And when the auction notices appeared in the farm papers days later, complete dispersal, everything must go, Michael read them in silence, because they weren't just selling tractors and land. They were selling the future he'd built his identity around. And for the first time since he'd left his father's kitchen, the certainty that had carried him forward cracked completely, replaced by the understanding that growth had never been the safety net he believed it was. It had been the risk itself, stretched thin across too many acres, too many loans, too many assumptions that the next year would always be better than the last. And as the operation unraveled with shocking speed, Michael realized that the real danger hadn't been the bad year. It had been the belief that one would never come. And by the time the dust settled enough for the consequences to become unavoidable, he knew exactly where he had to go, even if he didn't yet know what he would say when he got there. The headlights came up the Patterson driveway on a warm September evening in 1983, slower than they used to, hesitating at the curve where the gravel narrowed and the trees leaned in. And Ray noticed them without turning his head, because some things you recognize before you consciously register them, the way a man knows the sound of his own gate opening in the dark. And he kept working, kept the grease gun moving along the fittings of the Farmall H, the same rhythm he had followed for decades, because stopping too early would have meant admitting what he already knew. And the truck rolled to a stop near the shed without the confidence it once had. No company logo on the door, no urgency in the engine, just the quiet ticking of hot metal cooling. And when the door opened, Michael stepped out and stood there for a moment as if he was unsure whether he was allowed to be there. His shoulders rounded, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets even though the evening was still warm. And when he finally said "Dad," his voice carried something Ray had never heard before. Not anger, not certainty, but a thinness, like it had been worn down by too many nights without sleep. And Ray answered with just Michael, because there was no need to bridge the distance yet. And they stood facing each other in the half-light of the shed, surrounded by machines that had never asked either of them to explain themselves. The Farmall H sitting patient and quiet, red paint dulled by time but unashamed of it. The John Deere 4020 still streaked with dust from the afternoon's work. And Michael broke the silence by saying, "It's over," and Ray nodded once, slow and deliberate. Not because he was cold to the news, but because he had learned long ago that reacting too quickly to a collapse never helped anyone stand back up. And Michael went on, words tumbling out now that the first one had been said, telling him the bank had pulled everything. Operating loans frozen, fuel accounts cut, parts suppliers refusing orders. How men who'd worked there for years were sent home with nothing but a handshake and an apology that sounded hollow even as it was spoken. And Ray listened without interruption, his hands still resting on the grease gun. Because this wasn't confession, it was inventory, the careful recounting of losses after the fire had already burned through. And when Michael finally stopped to catch his breath, Ray asked quietly, "What about you?" And Michael laughed, a short, bitter sound that surprised even him, and said, "They let us all go last week. Couldn't make payroll." And there it was, the part that couldn't be softened, the part Michael had driven all this way to say out loud. And Ray felt the weight of it settle not in his chest, but in his stomach, the place where a man carries responsibility whether he admits it or not. And Michael looked around the shed then, really looked, at the rows of tools hanging exactly where they had been since he was a boy, at the concrete floor worn smooth by years of boots and spilled oil, at the absence of hurry, and he said, almost to himself, "I watched it happen, Dad." And Ray waited, because some lessons finish themselves if you give them room. And Michael talked about the meetings that had stopped being about yields and started being about creditors, about how every solution involved borrowing more to cover what had already been borrowed, about the unspoken understanding that if the weather didn't cooperate perfectly, they were done. And then the weather did cooperate, and it still wasn't enough. And his voice cracked when he described the morning the bank representatives arrived. Not loud or aggressive, just efficient, clipboards in hand, ownership transferring with signatures instead of gunfire. And how Mr. Henderson sat at his desk with his head in his hands, a man Michael had believed was invincible reduced to silence. And Michael said they weren't farming anymore. They were servicing debt. Every decision, every acre, every bushel was about making the next payment. And Ray set the grease gun down then, not because he needed to, but because he recognized that sentence for what it was. The moment the truth stopped being theoretical, and Michael finally said the words that had been pressing against his ribs since the day the equipment stopped running. "You were right," and Ray didn't correct him, didn't say anything at all, because this wasn't about right and wrong. It was about understanding the cost of being wrong. And Michael's shoulders sagged as if the admission itself had taken something out of him. And he asked, "Do you still need help here?" And Ray looked at him carefully before answering, because he needed to see whether this was desperation or clarity. And he asked, "What about all those ideas you had?" And Michael shook his head slowly and said, "I need to learn yours." And something in Ray's chest loosened then. Not triumph, not relief, but recognition, because the lesson had finally arrived intact. And he reached for a wrench and held it out without ceremony, saying the Farmall needed attention. And Michael took it instinctively, the weight familiar, grounding. And they worked together as the light shifted from gold to gray, Ray showing Michael how to listen to the engine instead of watching gauges, how to feel when something was off before it broke. And Michael realized how much of that knowledge had been waiting for him, buried under spreadsheets and projections. And he talked as they worked about the auction estimates, about 3-year-old tractors that had cost over $100,000, now expected to bring a fraction of that, about banks standing around equipment like it already belonged to them. And Ray said quietly that it always went that way when everyone was selling at once, because urgency destroyed value faster than rust ever could. And Michael stopped working for a moment and said, "I thought bigger meant safer," and Ray answered without judgment, "Bigger just means there's more to lose." And when the engine finally fired and settled into its steady rhythm, the sound filled the shed like a promise that didn't need explaining. And Michael stood there listening, eyes closed, because for the first time in years nothing felt like it was about to collapse under him. And when he asked if he could come back, really come back, Ray said yes without conditions, because the price had already been paid in full. And as darkness settled and the lights clicked on, the two of them kept working, not fixing the past, not undoing decisions, just restoring something that had never been broken in the first place. And in that quiet, ordinary evening, the real climax of the story passed without applause or argument, marked only by a man finally understanding the cost of chasing growth without control, and another man knowing that the thing he had built slowly had survived long enough for that understanding to matter. They worked together after that without announcing it to anyone, without making a point of it, because real changes rarely come with ceremony. And by the time the next planting season arrived, Michael had already settled into the old rhythm again, waking before dawn, listening to the weather instead of the market reports, measuring time in hours of daylight instead of quarterly projections. And Ray watched him quietly from a distance, not correcting unless asked, because there was a difference now in the way Michael moved through the work, slower, more deliberate, like someone who understood that speed was only useful when it didn't cost you control. And the farm itself didn't change much on the surface, still 320 acres, still the same tractors, still the same routines. But something underneath had shifted, a tension released, a need to prove replaced by a commitment to endure. And the 80s pressed down hard on agriculture after that, harder than most people remember unless they lived through it. Interest rates climbing into numbers that sounded unreal, land values collapsing, neighbors disappearing quietly one by one, farms auctioned off in pieces, bank signs going up where families had lived for generations. And Michael watched it all with new eyes now, recognizing patterns he'd been blind to before. The way leverage magnified every mistake, the way one bad year exposed a decade of fragile decisions. And the Patterson farm stayed put, not untouched, not immune to worry, but standing, because nothing about it depended on permission from anyone else to continue. And when they sold their crops, the checks came to them, not to creditors. And that simple fact carried more weight than any yield record ever could. And years passed that way, the work steady, the seasons turning. And in 1991, when much of the damage had already been done and the landscape of the county looked thinner, emptier, Michael came in from the field one evening and told Ray that the Morrison place had finally gone up for sale. 200 acres bordering their North 40. Good ground, neglected but sound, and Ray listened without reacting. Because the man he'd been in 1978 would have heard that as temptation, but the man he was now heard it as a question that deserved careful handling. And Michael laid out the numbers slowly, not with excitement, but with caution, pointing out that the bank was willing to deal, that they had the cash, that they could pay outright without borrowing a dime. And Ray asked the question that mattered most. What about equipment? And Michael answered the way Ray himself would have years earlier, saying maybe they'd work longer days, maybe it would take more time, but time they had. And Ray smiled then, just slightly, because it wasn't the purchase that mattered, it was the reasoning behind it. And they bought the land that winter, paid cash, no fanfare, and planted all 520 acres the following spring with the same old equipment. Slower, yes, but finished. And the farm absorbed the expansion without strain because it hadn't been forced. And when Ray finally handed Michael the deed years later, standing in the same shed where so many arguments and reconciliations had quietly resolved themselves, there was no speech, no warning, just a simple acknowledgement of trust. And Michael held the papers longer than necessary, feeling the weight of what they represented, not acreage or value, but the accumulation of decisions that had prioritized staying power over speed. And he promised not to let it slip away, not as a dramatic vow but as a matter of fact. because by then he understood that farms weren't lost in single moments of failure. They were lost slowly, one borrowed justification at a time. And the Farmall H still sat in the corner, older now, paint worn thin, seat recovered more than once, gauges unreliable. But the engine fired every time. And when Michael's son asked why they didn't buy new tractors like other farms, Michael took him into the shed and showed him the old machine, told him who had bought it, who had worked it, who had learned on it, and said it wasn't about horsepower or efficiency. It was about owning your work instead of owing it to someone else. And years later, when Michael stood in front of a room full of young farmers at a meeting and told the story of leaving home, of thinking bigger meant safer, of watching a $20 million operation collapse in months, the room stayed quiet not because they were impressed, but because they recognized themselves somewhere in the arc. And when someone asked if he ever regretted not expanding faster, not chasing the biggest possible operation, Michael answered honestly, saying the only thing he regretted was the time he'd wasted believing wisdom was outdated. And as the meeting broke up and the chairs scraped back and people headed out into the night, carrying their own calculations and fears, the lesson didn't follow them as advice, it followed them as an image. A small farm still standing after most of the big ones were gone. A machine built to last still doing its job decades later. And a simple truth that settled in quietly once the noise faded. That success wasn't about how fast you grew or how impressive you looked while doing it. It was about whether you were still there when the growing stopped, whether you still had choices when conditions turned against you, and whether the thing you built could survive not just the good years, but the bad ones too, because those were the years that decided everything. And long after Ray was gone, and Michael was older than his father had been the day they argued in that kitchen, the Farmall H still started on cool mornings, still teaching the same lesson without ever saying a word. That some things endure not because they are new or fast or large, but because they are owned, understood, and protected from the kind of ambition that confuses movement with progress. And that in the end, the quiet farms that survived weren't the ones that had won. They were the ones that had refused to lose,